Welcome to a popular history of unpopular things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. But before we begin, a reminder to please support me on Patreon. Putting out episodes takes a lot of work, actually. You'd be surprised, and I'm a one-woman show. So any kind of support will help ensure that this podcast gets to keep going strong. I appreciate any help that you can give me, and thank you so much, regardless, for being a fan. On with the show. Once again, you've opened up an episode with the word cannibal in the title. So, in case you're not already clued into the topic of today's episode, it's going to be gross. Straight up cannibalism in this one, okay? Not a vague reference, not a hint. It's going to be full on human eating human action. You've been warned. In 1933, Joseph Stalin was in the midst of a purge. The most famous purge he had going on in 1933 was the Ukrainian Famine, also known as the Holodomor. I'll get into that today as well to a lesser extent, but that wasn't the only thing that Stalin was doing that year. He was also sending millions of people to labor camps in Siberia, or gulags, right? But thousands of those who were rounded up were sent to a place known as Nazino, an island in the Ob River in the middle of Siberia. And I do mean the middle. Geographically, if you look on a map, like Nazino is more or less the center of Russia. Thousands of kilometers east of Moscow, the capital. They were left to fend for themselves with no shelter and virtually no food, except, of course, each other. If you're an AF-OUT fan, then you already know probably an uncomfortable amount of information about cannibalism. Maybe you came to the podcast already knowing an uncomfortable amount of cannibalism. It's why we get on so great, right? But if you've listened to a bunch of my episodes, you probably know where this is going. These people were left in the cold with no options of escape because they were guarded, and they had very little food. The guards that were there were corrupt and violent, so with a few other options, some decided to turn on each other. So today, we're going to serve up the historical context to get a good idea of why Stalin was targeting his own people and sending them to their gruesome deaths in the Siberian wastelands. I also want to explore other things that Stalin was doing to his people, like the aforementioned Ukrainian famine, to get a broader picture of life in early Soviet Russia. Once we know why this happened, we'll sort through the details of life on Nazino Island, including some primary sources of people who were there at the time of the incident, and explain how and why they gobbled each other up. So let's get started. So, as always on the AF-OUT podcast, we'll start with the historical context. Basically, it's what was happening in the 1930s that led to thousands of Russians being dumped on an island in the Siberian River without proper food or shelter. To properly understand any event in history, we need the context, right? The background information, the reasons why. And for today's episode, the context is all about Joseph Stalin's rule over Soviet Russia. So let's do a real quick bio. In 1917, Russia pulled out of World War I as a looming revolution threatened to upend the absolute monarch who was Tsar Nicolas II. Russia up to this point was capitalist, more or less, but not democratic. The Russian Tsar held all of the power. But Russia's problem, unlike its Western European counterparts, was that its industrial sector was delayed and, frankly, inadequate. It lagged behind the West. Russia was a massive agrarian power, agrarian meaning agricultural. So in order to catch up to the West in terms of its industry and technological development, it engaged in what we call state-sponsored industrialization. Industrialization that's been sponsored by the state, right? Made in part by the government. But it wasn't super successful. Russia lagged in a lot of areas, not just in industry and the economy, but also in war. They lost a conflict against Japan, of all places, between 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. Japan, for what it's worth, was also undergoing state-sponsored industrialization at this point, but they were significantly better at it. It helps that they were supported by the American economy. But the Russian people noticed that things were not going well for them. Lagging behind the West was bad and embarrassing enough, but losing a war against the small island nation of Japan, which chose to isolate itself from the rest of the world into the late 19th century, that's the 1800s, that was an insult. And from this uncertainty rose the Communist Party under Vladimir Lenin. Lenin's goal was to remove what he considered to be a failing absolute monarchy and replace it with a communist dictatorship, one led by his Bolshevik party, but would serve to benefit the common people. So Lenin believed that Russia was too backwards to have a quote unquote traditional communist revolution, which Karl Marx, the one of the founding fathers of communism, if you will, described as a revolution led by the proletariat, which is the working class. But Vladimir Lenin kind of reasons that the working class wouldn't be capable of doing this in Russia, where industry was very much lagging behind the agrarian sector. So, to make this revolution happen, Lenin and his Bolshevik party did the revolution for the proletariat. After all, it was for their own good, or so he argued. Now, this idea is more akin to socialism. The government, in this case the Bolshevik Party, which later becomes the government taking over for the benefit of the common people. Lenin believed that once the socialist state was successful, then they could start to remove social classes, the state itself would dissolve, slowly die off, right? And Russia would be a true communist utopia. But of course, that's not what happened. The 1917 revolution was successful. In 1918, the entire Russian royal family, Tsar Nicolas II, his wife, their 5 children, including Anastasia, if you're a fan of that movie, and their servants were all murdered, shot to death, then impaled by bayonets. You know, the blades you affix onto the end of a rifle or a weapon, right? The pointy bit. Now, with Lenin in power, the Bolsheviks got to work fixing Russia's economy, defeating rival political factions, and spreading communist ideals throughout the country. When Lenin died in 1924, one of his chief operatives took over, and that was Joseph Stalin. Now, one of Stalin's primary goals was to make sure that his new government, under the Communist Party, had full control over the state. It had strayed far from the idea of a communist utopia at this point. Stalin didn't want the government to fizzle out so that everyone could be equal and live in peace. He wanted to be in control of a communist dictatorship, to have absolute power. And the way he ensured this was to get rid of anyone who wasn't on board the communist train. So in 1933, Stalin began a campaign known as the Great Purge. The idea, as the name might imply, was to purge Russia and the Communist Party of any opposition, known or suspected opposition. The Soviet communist state was built on this idea of a single, centralized state. So, therefore, opposition threatened communist leadership. Questioning the authorities or the status quo was not, and by the way, still is not tolerated by quote unquote communist countries today. Now, during this time, over 1 million Russians were imprisoned, and a lot of these prisoners were sent to the gulags, or forced labor camps, many of which were in the frozen Siberian tundras in the north. Between 1934 and 1937, over 700,000 of them were executed by various means, starved in the camps, worked themselves to death, or just shot and killed. And though it was brutal, the end result did give Stalin absolute control over the Communist Party and therefore the government, which is what he wanted all along. Now, before we get to Nazino and the cannibals, right, which was one of these places, by the way, where opponents and prisoners were rounded up and sent, I want to talk about one of the more infamous of Stalin's purges, the Holodomor of 1932 to 1933, also known as the Ukrainian Famine. Not only is it a fascinating microcosm of Stalin's purges, but it will also give us some good context for what life was like being intentionally starved by your state. I don't know if you can hear that, but an ambulance just went by. So, one of Stalin's policies to increase his control over Russia and lands that he believed belonged to Russia was collectivization. The idea behind collectivization was to round up or collect all of the lands, farms, industries, whatever, and take away ownership from the people, and instead give it to the state. Classic socialism, right? Let me give you an example to help make this a little bit easier. So we have a Ukrainian family. Let's call them the Doroshenkos, okay? Now, the Doroshenkos work on a big farm in the middle of Europe's breadbasket, which is the rich grain producing area of Eastern Europe. It's known as the breadbasket, mostly in Ukraine. They used to own this land themselves, but Stalin came in and collectivized the land. The farm no longer belongs to the Doroshenkos, it belongs to the state. There are two options, okay? You either give up your land and you bow down to the power of the state, or you resist. It's kind of the only options you had. Now, if the Doroshenkos willingly gave up their lands, they would be moved to one of the government's collective farms. They would use their skills as farmers to support the state from this centralized area. The idea here, and this is kind of just true of communism in general, is that everybody needs to pitch in so that everybody can share the profits or the food, what have you, equally. Some people are fine with this. They're doing it to work towards the communist utopia, right? We all work for everyone's benefit. Fine, great, works for me. The other option, of course, is to resist. After all, the Doroshenkos have owned this land for generations, right? And now the Russians are going to come in and take it? Yeah, no, not into it. Now, we've established already that the communist state, specifically Russia, but all communist states really, is not cool with dissension, right? People opposing the party's ideals don't like it. So those kinds of people are going to need to be dealt with. Farmers who refused to give up their lands were branded kulaks, which basically just means rich peasants, but in a derogatory way. People who oppose the communist ideology of raising up those lower classes so that everybody can exist on the same plane. By painting them as enemies of the poor, they were branded enemies of the state. And what do we do with these rich capitalist enemies who won't do what the socialist state wants? Well, we eliminate them, right? We round them up, throw them in the gulags. Maybe they'll just disappear overnight, dispose of them, whatever. There's no room for dissidents in communist Russia. Now, our family here, the Doroshenkos, they know better, okay? So let's just say that they give up their farm. Beats being murdered, right? So they're moved to one of these collective farms, and they and the rest of the collective farms are given a quota to meet, a certain amount of grain that they need to produce every year to satisfy the wants of the communist state. But the problem now, when we're talking more so in the beginning of 1932, when this becomes more of an issue, is that the Soviet state keeps upping this quota, making it almost impossible for farmers like the Doroshenkos to meet the demand. And if they didn't send enough food, then special teams, right, military police would be brought in to take whatever extra food was left around to make up the difference in the quota that was missing, which included the food that farmers like the Doroshenkos needed to survive. I mean, you can't have farmers making food and then not eating it because then the farmers die off, right? Essentially, the Ukrainian farmers were left to starve, and a lot of them did. Stealing or hiding this food that was meant for the Soviet state, that was a crime punishable by death. And in the end, millions starved. And this food, the food that was supposed to be shared equally amongst the Soviet communist population, that was the point, right? Like, we're all working for everyone's mutual benefit. I'm raising the food. That guy over there is working in a factory. The stuff he produces and the food that I make will share equally. That was supposed to be the point, right? Well, a lot of this food that was being taken out of the mouths of the farmers was sold internationally so that the Soviets could make money to increase their power and control. Modern death toll estimates, this has changed, it's a little lower than the historic ones, but modern death toll estimates for the Ukrainian famine are currently around 3.9 million people who starved to death as a result of the collectivization of Ukrainian farms. Though I've seen ranges that almost double that figure. It's difficult for historians to get accurate numbers with mass genocides like this because there just weren't accurate records taken for peasants in rural Ukraine. But anyway, my point here is to say that Stalin had no problem killing off his own people to pursue power and communist control. And at the same time that Stalin was starving his Ukrainian subjects, he also sent a bunch of people to a tiny island in the middle of the Ob River in Siberia. now known as either Death Island or my preferred nickname, Cannibal Island. Now, before we get to the gross cannibal stuff, we still need to answer the question, why this island, right? Why did the communist government decide to send people here instead of an established labor camp in the north? And also, who got sent there and how were they chosen? Lots of questions still. So let's set that up before we start talking about, the people eating bit. Well, Nazino was just part of a grander plan to settle in western Siberia. It was knocking out two birds with one stone, if you will. You could get rid of people you don't want around anymore, and then also build settlements in this resource rich but relatively unpopulated region in the west. And who was chosen? Well, I say in the west. It's really east of Moscow, but I'm talking like western Siberia. And who was chosen? Well, typically those kulaks, right? Those rich peasants who supposedly stood in the way of Soviet progress, like the Ukrainian farmers who didn't want to give up their land to collectivization. It was what we call deportation colonization. You can get rid of people you don't want anymore and have them do the work of colonizing new regions. They can fish, or they can fell trees, or mine, or maybe they can farm, and they give most of that back to the state while keeping what they need to survive. Win-win in terms of the Soviets' perspective, anyway. And this was supposed to be a big thing, an idea that would encompass over 1 million hectares of arable land, create thousands of new labor villages. But the problem is, something like that's going to require a lot of capital, right? It's going to require a lot of resources and labor. But labor wouldn't be a problem because that's why they would take away the people who were dissenting against the state, right? That's where they would send those troublesome farmers, the kulaks, also political dissidents, and they could do their time out there creating a new settlement. And so, in 1933, a whole bunch of people were rounded up from major cities like Moscow and Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg, and shipped out east. The state's goal was to establish a self sufficient settlement within 2 years. It shouldn't need any more supplies from the state after 2 years, but instead should be providing excess things and sending them back to Mother Russia so the government could do what it wanted with it, which probably wasn't share it, was probably going to be selling it, but whatever, right? Now, Nazino Island became one of these locations. It certainly wasn't the only, but it was one of them. Those who were sent to Nazino came from a city called Tomsk, the nearest city, which is about 300 miles or 480 kilometers downriver south of where Nazino Island is. They had nothing with them, these people. No documentation, no personal items, no provisions, nothing. They had the clothes on their backs. Some of them had hats, not all of them. Not only would that make it hard to survive out in the middle of literal nowhere, but there was no paperwork explaining who they were, why they were arrested, or whether or not they had a criminal past. And some did have a criminal past, mind you, but it was often just petty criminals who had sentences of less than 5 years. And considering that this was supposed to be a settlement, an alternative to a labor camp, right? There were a surprising amount of people who would not have been able to do any work of settling a completely new environment. The elderly, the disabled, and even the blind. So this lends to the idea that it wasn't really about producing labor for the benefit of the state. It was about getting rid of people they considered undesirable. As stated, by the way, I'm not just saying that, that was stated in the inquiries that took place after the events. The state was, quote, relieving themselves of burdens by sending them as far away as possible, end quote. So now it's not just the kulaks, the rich peasants, right? It's not just petty criminals or supposed enemies of the state, but also those the state deemed to be burdens. They were rounded up off the streets of Moscow, and if they didn't have paperwork proving that they belonged in Moscow, they were sent away, sometimes taken right from their families who didn't know any different about where these people disappeared to. But I guess it was common enough that people just knew it was going to happen. Now, those responsible for organizing the settlement were also afraid of the kinds of people being sent over, because again, some of them were petty criminals, right, from urban city centers that were being sent off to these remote settlements, so essentially they wouldn't cause any problems. But that's a problem too, because the Soviets, in addition to getting rid of people, are also trying to settle areas in the East, right? So why would they send people that they consider to be criminals? Wouldn't that just mess up their plans? It doesn't make sense. And that is why the island was chosen over, I don't know, literally anywhere else. It was across the river from a small settlement of indigenous folk, but perhaps by being on an island, the deportees couldn't escape and cause mischief for the surrounding populations, and by extension, the state. I guess they didn't care about the other people living there with these supposed criminal elements, but whatever. Now, on the boat heading to their final destination, as it were, there were some food rations, but this amounted to a few bags of semolina flour, which is what you use to make good pasta, by the way, sugar, salt, and about 20 tons of flour. It amounted to, I don't know, 10 days worth of food, but only if they turned that flour into bread. There was no yeast, though, so it would have been essentially hardtack, but it could have worked for 10 days. But that assumes that they had utensils for cooking as well. Other than the ingredients, the deportees were given nothing. No bowls, no spoons, no dishes, no tools, nothing. They didn't have anything on them to help make shelter either, or even rudimentary ovens to bake this bread. They were just literally given a pile of flour with some sugar and salt. And I do mean a pile, no bags, it's just a pile of flour. Now you might be wondering, if they're sending these men and women, some of whom are considered dangerous, into the wilds with very little food, did they at least send guards? I mean, Soviet guards might be scary enough to keep them under control, right? Well, yes and no to the sending them, not the scariness. Now, normally, with a population the size of what they were sent to Nazino, around 5 to 6,000 people, there would be about 50 guards sent to monitor them. After all, remember, this is supposed to be a labor camp in addition to a new settlement, but they had apparently had a hard time scrounging up 50 guards, so instead they just took unemployed men wandering the streets of Tomsk, that town that's about 300 miles south of Nazino Island. And some of these men didn't even know what they were brought along for. Here's a source from one of the men who helped organize the whole disaster. Quote, "These people, who had neither shoes nor uniforms, were in no way distinguished from those they were supposed to monitor. They had neither authority or discipline. If they gave an order, no one listened to them. We had hardly arrived in Nazino before most of them told me that they wanted to go back to Tomsk because they had been tricked. When they were recruited, they had been promised that the local officials would take care of them, give them a uniform, shoes, and lodgings in Alexandrovskoye, a nearby town. However, all they got was an old rifle, and then they were sent into the taiga to have people graze, as they called it." End quote. The taiga, by the way, is the name for the coniferous forests up there in northern Russia. So the guards brought in to watch over the men and women sent to Nazino, they weren't really guards. So I'm sure it's no surprise for you to hear that they stole and were generally pretty corrupt, as they were more or less drifters that were now given a modicum of power over prisoners. On May 18th, 1933, the boats from Tomsk landed at an abandoned island in the middle of the Ob River and unloaded its passengers. And according to many corroborated sources, which means there are multiple sources saying the same thing, around a third of the people were already weakened and feeble, half starved from the journey itself. So it was a disaster waiting to happen. Around 20 tons of flour was dumped on the ground, again, not in sacks, literally just piled into a flour mountain, and as you can imagine, a fight broke out almost immediately for the food. The guards opened fire, a few people were injured, and the decision was made to put the bulk of the flour across the river in the nearby town of Nazino so it wouldn't be stolen. And by town, I really just mean a small settlement of the indigenous peoples that were living there. It's not like they were things, right? There were no accommodations. Now, the next morning, people lined up to receive their rations of flour from the guards, 1 pound per person. But remember, there's no other provisions, and there were about 5,000 plus people there. These men and women collected their flour rations mostly just in their hands, kind of like an Oliver Twist situation, just with whatever they had with them. Some of them, if they had hats, would collect their flour rations in their hat if they, again, were lucky enough to have one. You could imagine it didn't take long for this process to break down, and it turned into a mad scramble for food. People were trampled, guards opened fire again, and it was just chaos. General chaos. Here's a source that describes what it looked like in Nazino just 2 days after arriving. Quote, "At 2 p.m. on May 20th, I went to the island of Nazino with Commander Sepkov. There was a terrible scramble, people crowding and fighting around the bags of flour. Dead bodies everywhere, 100 or more, and lots of people crawling about and crying, "Give us bread, boss! It's been 2 days since we've been giving anything to eat. They're trying to make us die of hunger and the cold." End quote. And here, my dear AFOUT fans, is where we get our first source from Nazino detailing cannibalism. Continuing with the same source, quote, "They told us that people had begun eating the dead bodies, that they were cooking human flesh. The scene on the island was dreadful, appalling. When we got back to the village of Nazino, we gathered together all of the assistant commanders and health personnel, barely a dozen persons in all. It was decided, 1, to set up a few tents to shelter the most sick, and 2, to mobilize the local population to construct ovens." End quote. And they mean ovens for baking bread so they didn't have to eat each other, not ovens for cremation. But y'all, 2 days. It only took 2 days for cannibalism to start. Although to be fair, the 6 or so days stuck in the bottom of boats en route to Nazino were also pretty awful, and they had no food, so the people were starving and pretty much crazed by the time that they arrived. So let's get into the meaty part of this episode, the cannibalism. Now, fast forward a lot. 1989, 56 years later, an organization was going around recording and preserving oral histories of Soviet political oppression. It was part of a project associated with Gorbachev's perestroika reforms. Now, a group went to Nazino and listened to an older indigenous woman who lived nearby the island in 1933 when all these people were dumped off there, and would travel with her family to that small village across the way in Nazino every year to find supplies. Here's what she recounted. And warning, it's gross. Quote, "We were living in Ergenkina. Every spring, we left for the island of Nazino to harvest the poplar bark that we sent downstream. It was our only source of income. That year, what did we see? People everywhere. So many people, we didn't understand what was going on. They were trying to escape. They asked us, where's the railway? We'd never seen a railway. They asked, where's Moscow, Leningrad? They were asking the wrong people. We'd never heard of those places. On the island, there was a guard named Kostya Venikov, a young fellow. He was courting a pretty girl who had been sent there. He protected her. But one day, he had to be taken away for a while, and he told one of his comrades, take care of her. But with all these people there, the comrade couldn't do much. People caught the girl, tied her to a poplar tree, cut off her breasts, her muscles, everything they could eat. They were hungry, they had to eat. When Kostya came back, she was still alive. He tried to save her, but she had lost too much blood. She died. And that was the kind of thing that happened. When you went along the island, you saw flesh wrapped in rags, human flesh that had been cut and hung in the trees. I heard that when people on the island saw a doctor pass by, they said, there's one that would be good to eat, fat as he is. The doctor, of course, ran away. And yet, how much flour there was on the riverbank. They'd brought in a mountain of flour to feed people, but what they did with it, no one knows. One thing is certain, it rotted. Or maybe someone stole it. I don't know whether it was stolen or not. What I do know is that people were starving to death. Some people fled the island on rafts, on tree trunks. One day, starving to death, hardly able to stand up, a few of them tried to attack our cow. We went to stop them. People thought they ought to give them a little bread. There were women among them, and that made us feel more confident. We took them home, we gave them bread, curds, and milk, and then we took them back to the guardhouse. God knows what they did with them afterward. Maybe they shot them, or they escaped, or they were taken back to the island. My lord, what cruelty. Of course, God knows what these people did. We didn't know them, they scared us. We gave them milk to drink and fed them, and afterwards they were shot by the guards. End quote. This is just one account of many about the atrocities that happened at Nazino. And it wasn't just the deportees attacking each other, the guards, those random young men from the streets of Tomsk, were also complicit. With the little bit of power they had over the others, they used blackmail and coercion to get what they wanted, and in several instances, just straight up killed prisoners to take their coats or supplies. Now, during the inquiry that happened after this event, several men were called out for their actions. One threw deportees into the river knowing they couldn't swim, so they drowned. Another used a stick to beat the deportees, taking clothing from them. Another sent men into the frozen waters to retrieve birds he shot. And yet another would stuff himself with the food rations in front of the deportees just to tease them. But beyond all this, there was also just straight up murder. The guards gave two explanations for why they would shoot and kill a man. They were either trying to escape to join criminal bands forming on the islands, probably because they were stuck there as prisoners with no food, or because they were cannibals. On May 21st, so 3 days after they first arrived there, health officers were sent to check in on the island's inhabitants as they heard reports that the dead were piling up. And here's what those health officers wrote in a report. Quote, "The liver, the heart, the lungs, and the fleshy parts of the bodies, like breasts and calves, had been cut off. One of the bodies, the head, had been cut off, along with the male genital organs and parts of the skin. These mutilations constitute strong evidence of cannibalistic acts. In addition, they suggest the existence of serious psychopathologies." On the same day, May 21st, the deportees themselves brought us three individuals who had been caught with blood on their hands and holding human livers. Our examination of these three individuals did not reveal any extreme emaciation, but rather external signs of degeneracy. End quote. So the doctors here are saying that these men, caught literally red-handed, weren't emaciated and eating their fellow man out of necessity, but because they were psychopaths. Now, before you get too excited about these sources, also consider the bias here. The state would want to paint this situation as an aberration of the prisoners they had, right? Not taking responsibility for, I don't know, leaving these people alone on an island with basically no food. I'm not saying it was justified. I'm just reminding you to consider all sides of a story and to remember that every source has bias. Now, apparently, there wasn't immediate reaction to this source. Those bloody hands caught in possession of human organs were just released back into Gen Pop, as it were, released back onto the island because, and again, I'm quoting, "it had not been established that they had killed the person whose body parts they had eaten." And, quote, "the Soviet Penal Code does not prescribe a penalty for necrophagy, which is eating dead flesh. It doesn't have to be human, by the way. Vultures and necrophages, they just eat carrion or dead meat. So eating dead flesh, eating carrion, necrophagy." Now, the first recorded act of murder that resulted in cannibalism in Nazino, again, recorded act of murder, took place on May 29th, which is 11 days after arrival, when three young men were caught and captured, then sent to prison in the nearest bigger town. Three more cannibal murderers were arrested on May 31st after they admitted to killing a man and eating his livers and kidney. The state tried to paint this as cannibalism by habit, which means that they were engaged in cannibalism because they were criminals, and that's just what these criminals did. It was an othering, right? Paint them out to be really bad by painting them as criminals. Oh, this is just what criminal elements do. They eat people. They didn't take responsibility for the fact that they were shoved on an uninhabited island with no resources, nothing to eat except raw flour mixed with, like, river water, which, by the way, caused gastrointestinal problems and all kinds of fevers, and a broken power dynamic between the guards and the prisoners. One report from the head of the Special Settlements Department, which spearheaded and oversaw settlements at places like Nazino, claims that, quote, "hunger cannot be the origin of these acts, given that most of the cases of cannibalism occurred at a time when the problem of provisions was being resolved. None of the cannibals caught showed signs of pronounced emaciation. Several of them admitted that in the past they had already eaten human flesh." End quote. And by the way, y'all, that's just straight up not true. So, why was the Soviet state trying to paint these deportees as criminal necrophages or murderous cannibals? Well, consider what the state is doing, and also consider the context that I set up earlier. The Soviets deported these people because they were either in the way or they were suspected non communists, right? So painting them as criminals or cannibals or horrible, evil people aligned with that message that deporting them was good for the communist state. Considering we know that other instances of violence against their own people were occurring simultaneously with what was happening at Nazino, like the Ukrainian famine, right? The state needed to cover up their involvement and make it seem like the people themselves were deranged, not the situation they were put in. Were some of them deranged before arriving? Possibly, but I'll wager a bet that since they were picked up on the streets of Moscow, then shoved in transportation for a while with no proper meals, and then abandoned on an island with corrupt, power mad guards and no access to food, probably had something to do with them turning to cannibalism to survive. Saying that cannibalism was a response to the violence inherent in the system was a seditious concept. Presuming that the Soviet Communist government was ultimately responsible for cannibalism would not have been allowed. There is no freedom of expression in communist dictatorships. If you speak out against the party line, then you're an enemy of the state. Done. Plain and simple. A counter-revolutionary. And perhaps you'd find yourself in a similar situation to these people on Nazino. Now, in his book, titled Cannibal Island, Death in a Siberian Gulag, historian Nicolas Werth summarizes things pretty nicely. He writes that, quote, precisely how widespread was cannibalism in Nazino? Even if it left an indelible impression, to which the well-attested nickname Cannibal Island bears witness, the number of proven cases of cannibalism and necrophagy was not more than a few dozen. About 50 persons suspected of having eaten human flesh were arrested. 50 persons. But many of them were quickly released. Given the very fragmentary evidence we have regarding the identity of these individuals, it would be risky to draw any conclusions about the typical profile of the Nazino cannibal. End quote. The Nazino settlement was clearly a failure. Soviet authorities shifted the survivors, who only numbered around 2,800, to better policed and better settled camps upriver. It didn't get much better for them, though, as many of them died anyway, or contracted typhus and got super sick. One thing the Nazino incident did do, though, was to help end this colonization, deportation, settlement project. There was clearly not a good system put in place to handle deporting these men and women to new locations where they could be useful in settling out the frontier. Labor camps were much more useful to the state. Here, at least, they were producing something, right? The settlement projects were just abject failures, and they cost the state more than they got in return. It also made them look bad. Disorganized, chaotic, and incapable of moving towards the goal of a communist utopia, where people can function without rules or a system to keep them in check, where they would all work for the common cause and share things equally. Because that certainly didn't happen at Nazino, where the system broke down almost immediately. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelli Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Cannibal Island. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and join as a cannibal, an explorer, or a historian. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.